I think the reason why I chose to keep the word as it is, Othukkam, which is a word in my language, Malayalam, spoken on the southwestern coast of India, is largely because there is the artifice of clarity involved in using words like jouissance, Aufhebung, and so on, which are seen as somehow immediately translatable into human experience where they are not. So the idea here is to preserve the hardness of a word as it makes a transition to a concept. But before I begin, one of the things that weighs on our minds as we all gather here is also the fact of the violence we're inflicting on each other, as well as the violence that we're inflicting on nature, and indeed the death of childhood before our eyes as we watch that unceasing warfare being carried on. And I was reminded of Seamus Heaney's lines from the time of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where he speaks about the loss of childhood and the lines, I shouldered a kind of manhood bearing the coffins of dead relatives. And it's not so much the loss of manhood, but a sense of desolation that we have before us. The other thing that weighs on our consciousness is the violence that we inflict on nature, something that the earlier papers suggested and spoke about. So we have this wonderful Swiss artist, Mari Velardi, who has this installation called Atlas des Îles Perdues 2107 and the Atlas of Lost Islands. And what it is a room where the walls are painted in Klein blue. And there are these meticulously drafted maps of islands all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic to the Indian. And what she has done with these islands is the idea that some of these islands exist. We know of them. There's some which are vanishing, but by 2107, they will all have gone. So as we stand in the room, we see before us the past, present, and future all at once. And in many senses, this also connects up for me with the image of Gaza. Right? And am I seeing something that will exist? Do I see the future already? But all that said, what I want to do is to try and think about put three propositions before you before I get into the paper. The first has been this idea of trying to generate what I call demotic concepts, which is the idea that we need to think about the words that people use in everyday life, which then segue into what we call theoretical enterprise, which are then glossed by academics and so on, and circulate through the world of the political. And it's a constant movement, the dialectics, as it were, between the person, the book, and the theorist, and which we need to be conscious of and we need to think with, rather than, as I shall go on to, I'll go on to speak about Bakhtin's work in a while, that it's really necessary to think with the theories that, or think with words that are wrought from circumstances and to proceed from there. The second question that I want to put before you is that when I present a word like Othukkam, and very often what happens is that South Asians and others get sequestered into our spaces. There is a universality to concepts that come from Germany, France, America, and so on, whereas South Asian or Arabic or Chinese concepts are seen to have a hardness which renders them extremely local. Right? And as we know, the only reason why Western concepts are universal is that they were backed by colonialism and violence and so on. And so the universalization of those words has resulted from a hidden history of violence. The third thing is that when we proceed to theorize, as it were, from our spaces, we are obsessed very often with the idea of commensurability, right? That we try and create concepts that are commensurable in traditions in the West. So are there considerations on mind, matter, logic, for example? This is what the early African analytical philosophers did, where they rendered African philosophy in terms of ideas that came from elsewhere. So the necessity, again, exists to actually think from our spaces with ideas that need not be commensurable, right? They may retain a quiddity, as it were, an opacity, to use Glissant's term, and that is necessary. It gives pause before we so easily glide into a rendering of ourselves, as the Shakespearean phrase, alas, I have been translated, right? So the idea of demotic thinking, the idea of demotic theorizing, is something that, I mean, I put the dictionary meaning for you, but in this august and erudite audience, I'm sure most of you are aware of the meanings of demotic relating to the kind of language used by the ordinary people, colloquial and so on. But what I want to put before you is a quote from Bakhtin, who has been central to the ways in which I've tried to imagine what demotic thinking might be. I'm going to read out to you the parts I've highlighted in red. The word in language is half someone else's. It becomes one's own only when the speaker populates it with his own intention, his own accent, when he appropriates the word, adapting it to his own semantic and expressive intention. Now, the word he is obviously in quotation marks. It was written a long time ago. But for me, the crucial operative phrase in this quote is that the word does not exist in a natural and impersonal language. It is not, after all, out of a dictionary that the speaker gets its words, but rather it exists in other people's mouths. And this, for me, allows me to think against a whole tradition of Kozelekian, Raymond Williams, a whole set of thinkers who thought with concepts as they came out of dictionaries and as they came out of established traditions, and where the people were set aside, the demos were kept at a distance, as it were. So, in an ironic move, I begin with the dictionary. So this word Othukkam, what does it mean? And one of the interesting things about the word Othukkam is that the first mention of it is in the first mention of it in a dictionary is in the late 19th century, where Hermann Gundert, who is a great uncle of Hermann Hesse, the Nobel Prize winner, but Hermann Gundert was a missionary active in the southwestern coast of India. He compiles a Malayalam English dictionary, and what he does then is to basically travel around and get words out of the mouths of people into the dictionary. So he's consulting people, asking them. And again, it's an exercise of commensurability such as dictionaries engage in. So one of the first mentions of the word Othukkam is at the time that the British conquer this part of southern India, where Tipu Sultan, who is one of the reigning monarchs at that time, is subdued. And so the word Othukkam has this idea of subjugation, of bringing into obedience, creating a vassal of. So that is one hard political meaning that we have of the word. But then the idea, the word Othukkam contains within it these ideas of creating obedience in somebody to subordinate and so on and so forth. But by the time we get into the early 20th century, the word has acquired many other meanings, and there's a whole list there. A lot of them are in Malayalam. But here it begins to deal with questions of demeanor, comportment, respect, secrecy and deceit, post-conflict situation. So again, what it has is that it has segued from the idea of an imposed obedience to an internalized obedience, the idea of comportment. So here we have the dictionary. And then if you think about the word Othukkam as it's used in everyday conversation. So if I were to be in a city in Kerala, for example, and I want to get an auto rickshaw late at night, I might hail an auto rickshaw. The auto rickshaw driver will say, sorry, I can't come. The auto rickshaw is I am going to Othukkofy, to use a Salman Rushdieite verb. I'm going to Othukkofy, as it were, the auto, which means I'm going to keep it away. I'm going to keep it in a contained space. Or I might be in a bus, and I'm kind of dangling and all over the place, man-spreading, and somebody might say, hey, you need to Othukkofy yourself, contain yourself, right? Or I might get into a second-class train, throw my luggage in, as we are wont to do when you get into the second-class compartment, and then my luggage is all over the place, and somebody might say, put it all together. Hey, you can't really take up so much space. So we have moved from Tipu Sultan, the idea of obedience, subordination, subjugation. We have the idea of comportment. And then we have this idea of coming together, but more important than all of this is that the auto rickshaw driver who told me that he's going to put his auto rickshaw away might go home. And sitting at dinner with his wife and his daughter, and the daughter might raise his voice and he says, hey, you must exercise Othukkam, right? Which is feminine comportment. right? Which is where a woman is expected to sit with her legs together, shoulders bowed, not look a man in the eye, speak softly, and so on and so forth. So it is this range of meanings that I'm trying to recover in order to understand the political culture of the region that I come from. And when I talk about the political culture, the important thing to remember is that Kerala is a state about which two things you need to know. You know, there are one or two things that you need to know about Kerala, as Godard might have said. So the first thing you need to know about Kerala, it was the first state anywhere in the world to elect a communist government to power. And as a result of it, we have the highest rate of literacy in India. We have the best gender parity, the best educational system, the best health system, et cetera, and it's regarded by the United Nations as a model. Not that this is something that is necessarily a marker of anything, but is where without industrialization, the state has achieved indices that are similar to that of Scandinavia, for example. So there is communism and its histories, and this is the bright side of communism. We shall get to another aspect of it. The other thing is that large sections of the society in Kerala were matrilineal. I come from a matrilineal inheritance, which is where women inherited the property. The eldest woman was the ruler of the household, so to speak, and this was true until my grandmother's time. Then through a whole series of legislations and the emergence of a larger patriarchal ideology, matrimony is actually legislated out. 1975, an act of legislation abolishes matrimony, probably again, the first time that a kinship system is abolished by legislation. And then the rest, and after 1975, there's been a ceaseless attack on this memory of matrimony, the penumbral presence of female power, of female authority. And so it is a society which is progressive in many ways, but is very strongly patriarchal. And this patriarchy is being constructed before our very eyes. So the Communist Party comes into power, creating a space of Othukkam, and then the society is engaged in Othukkofying the women, bringing them back into line away from the legacy of matrimony. But this practice of Othukkam, of disciplining, of obedience, is something that is central to a caste society, right? Kerala, unlike many other parts of India, doesn't have the virulent forms of caste inegalitarianism. Communism has managed to address the questions of human dignity, self-respect, and so on. But not so long ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, you still had lower castes who could be killed, because even now the central question in India is, does the Dalit or the untouchable have a right to life? Right? There is a way in which there is a landscape of death that is occupied by former untouchable groups. So you have ritual forms like the Teyyam, where victims of upper caste violence are then deified. And then there are festivals held in which the whole story of oppression and of killing and of injustice is retold. This happens around February, around the harvest season. So the question of violence is always central, right? So there's one kind of violence, which is the male violence, which men enact on each other in the manner of politics. The other is the kind of gentle violence, the moral economy of gentleness and violence that is patriarchy, which men inflict on women, not so much in physical ways perhaps, but in forms of control. So when we think about Othukkam, right, keeping this history of Othukkam in mind, an interesting history that has emerged in Kerala is the fact that while Kerala is the most progressive state, and we have never ever elected a Hindu fundamentalist party, the BJP, they've never won any seats in our state. Right? So this is remarkable considering the saffron wave that is sweeping over India. But how is this done? The paradox that is part of the story is that the largest number of the militant units of the BJP, the RSS as it's called, there are over 5,000 units in Kerala, which is almost twice the number of the most populous state in India to the north of us, Uttar Pradesh. The way they are kept under control is through Othukkam. The Communist Party of India, Marxist, and the RSS have been engaged in an internecine warfare for the last 70 years, in the north of Kerala, extreme violence. Young men are inculcated or indoctrinated into masculinity. The trial by fire is this killing of the Hindu right wing, and vice versa. So the RSS and the CPIM have been in constant warfare with each other, and a lot of these create a whole histories of martyrdom. So the martyr stones that come up, there are red villages and saffron villages. And a lot of the violence is of an extremely brutal kind. People die of 53 stab wounds, right? And this is something that's difficult to understand. This is not gratuitous violence, it's incompetent violence. Because when you have these histories of feuds, and young men who don't know what it is to kill, they know how to play football, they know how to play hockey, but they're given knives and told, kill the murderer of your brother. They don't know how to kill surgically. So they're messy. So this Othukkam is something about the enactment of a particular form of male violence, which is politically, in many senses, radical. It keeps Hindu fundamentalism under control, but it also creates a paradigm in which to become a young man is to enter the world through violence, to enter masculinity through violence. So the Othukkam of the Hindu right wing creates a youthful masculinity in northern Kerala. The other way in which Othukkam works, so there is the subjugation, subordination, but there's also the idea of disciplining. So when a young man who, after his 5 kills or 6 kills or whatever it is, then aspires to rise within the party, the older political establishment will make sure to discipline him. They will Othukkofy him, right? Because he's now an upstart who's trying to rise too fast within the hierarchy. Let's get on to the idea of Othukkam as its practice, as a kind of practice of patriarchal subordination of women. So this is the typical image that you have of the wife. And as in most societies, Western and Eastern, there is this oscillation between the ideas of the virgin and the whore, right? I mean, the over-sexualized woman and then the submissive woman who is the husband's helpmeet, the haven from a heartless world, and so on and so forth. So this is a typical image. That's one of Malayalam cinema's best-known actors, Mammootty, and one can reproduce multiple scenes like this. And these exaltations of the wife as virtuous, as devout, as gentle, as submissive, as fragrant, and so on and so forth, songs and scenes. But alongside this, there is the enactment of a modern kind of Othukkam. So that was the traditional submissive kind of Othukkam. In Kerala, you have this a temple, a site of pilgrimage called Shabarimala, which is meant only for men, right? Only men and post-menopausal women are allowed there. So there was the whole agitation about saying, well, India is a democracy under the constitution. Everyone has a right to enter a place of religious worship. Young women should also be allowed to. The Supreme Court decrees that anyone can enter and women should be allowed to enter. But then a lot of the modern Malayali women who are dressed in modern fashion, salwar kameez as opposed to traditional saris and so on, and looking like young urban professionals, they start the Ready to Wait campaign, displaying Othukkam in public, right? So it's a performance of a modern femininity which is submissive to the patriarchal norms that discipline women in the area. So Ready to Wait became a big campaign, saying it's all very well, all of this is a bit too excessive, and we are willing to go along with the norms that are. Here, this was a celebrated case in 2020 where a young Muslim artist and mother got her daughter to paint her body, right? And this was seen, I mean, this was, how should I put it? It was problematic in so many ways. One, it was a young Muslim woman. So the Muslim male establishment was horrified. Secondly, for the Hindu establishment, this was an enticing female Muslim body which was drawing its youth unto, towards conversion, towards, so she was seen as a siren. So the court decided that this video, which is up on YouTube, should be taken down. There was a huge campaign that this young woman, Rehana Fatima, is not displaying Othukkam. The High Court finally decided that she has a perfect right to do what she wants. It's her body. But meanwhile, there were allegations that the child was being exploited, that this is not the relation that should exist between a mother and a child, and so on and so forth. But again, these discourses of Othukkam came to kind of work alongside notions of Hindu fundamentalism, as well as an Islamic patriarchy. So the word Othukkam is circulating through various spaces, but it also becomes a window into the structuring of a political institutional order, as well as a structure of individual self and subjectivity. Finally, I'll end with this example where you have one of Kerala's best-known actresses, Reema Kallingal, who appears on stage clad in a short skirt, right? And this becomes a huge issue. It becomes a huge issue when newspapers are commenting on it, political leaders are commenting on it, intellectuals are commenting on it, because if you look at the way in which she's dressed and the woman next to her is dressed, the woman next to her displays Othukkam. Obviously, she's completely covered, only her hands and her face are visible. Whereas with Reema Kallingal, her legs are shown, and then she casually replies to a critic saying, well, we have legs. What are you going to do about that? And so what I wanted to do through this word is to trace a longue durée history, as it were, something that hints at histories of colonialism, the subjugation of Tipu, the history of the constitution of a radical communist progressive state, which sets itself against Hindu fundamentalism and all that it represents. But that setting itself against is based on violence and notions of Othukkam, obedience, subjugation, and so on. And underlying all of this is the reconstitution of patriarchy after matrilineal, right? Where young women of all religions are expected to display Othukkam. So this gives you an idea of the larger project that we are all engaged in. There are 19 of us working with 19 Indian languages to excavate words which reflect political thought and practice, and it is out of the mouths of people rather than out of dictionaries, because the word Othukkam circulates in everyday conversation. Right? And it circulates in everyday conversation with potent force. To tell a young woman you are not displaying Othukkam will somehow disqualify her from marriage. When it's the Communist Party of India Marxist tells a young man, you need to display Othukkam. It's basically a warning that you'll have your feet cut out from under you if you aspire too fast to rise within the hierarchy. So in many ways, I think this gives us an indication of politics in all its dimensions, and that's basically the idea. So I'll stop here. Thank you.